For nearly 20 years, the towering oak had stood in the center of the front yard, its broad trunk weathered by countless seasons. It had been planted decades before the current owner even moved in, its roots digging deep into the earth, anchoring not just the soil, but the character of the neighborhood itself. Every fall, it shed a carpet of golden leaves across the lawn. Every spring, it bloomed with fresh green life. It was more than a tree, it was a living memory, a witness to time. The man who lived in the modest brick home beneath its shade had always seen it as a gift. On summer afternoons, children from down the street would gather under its branches, escaping the sun. Birds built nests high in the canopy, their chirps and songs filling the morning air. Even the older neighbors appreciated the charm it brought to the street, the way it stood proudly as a landmark for anyone visiting. For years, there had been peace on this little stretch of suburban life. Each resident kept their lawn trimmed, their hedges neat, and their homes well-maintained. The community rarely had disputes beyond the occasional parking annoyance or noise complaint. But that calm began to shift the day a new neighbor moved in next door. Her name wasn't officially known at first, but whispers and muttered comments began floating between other residents. She arrived with a shiny SUV, bright patio furniture, and a pair of mirrored sunglasses that she rarely took off. Her yard was soon manicured within an inch of its life. Edges perfectly straight, grass unnaturally uniform. Some saw her as meticulous. Others quietly called her overbearing. The trouble began subtly. At first, she was seen standing on her driveway, arms crossed, staring at the oak tree. Not in appreciation, but with something closer to disdain. Soon, there were small remarks made in passing, comments about too much shade, or how it really blocks the view of the sunset. Those comments grew into questions, then into demands whispered to mutual neighbors, planting seeds of discontent. It wasn't long before the man found himself receiving a letter in his mailbox, not from her directly, but from the homeowners association. The letter was oddly formal for such a minor concern. It stated that a neighbor had expressed concern that the tree obstructed their property's visibility and sunlight. There was no official violation cited, just a vague suggestion to consider removal for the betterment of neighborhood harmony. First, he brushed it off. The oak was healthy, well within property lines, and posed no safety risk. There was no legitimate reason to remove it, and certainly none that would outweigh its beauty and history. But the letters kept coming, each one slightly more pointed, each one hinting at possible escalation. The situation might have fizzled out there, had it not been for a strange and telling event. One morning, while raking the lawn, the man noticed something odd. The base of the oak's trunk had been marked with a faint line of bright orange spray paint. Not a random streak, but a deliberate ring, as if someone had measured the spot for cutting. A chill of realization sank in. This wasn't just casual annoyance from a neighbor. This was an attempt to pressure him into action, perhaps even to intimidate him into compliance. And though he had never been one for neighborhood drama, he knew something was brewing. It was only a week later when the knock came at his door. He opened it to see her standing there, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the oak in their lenses, lips pressed into a tight smile. Without so much as a greeting, she informed him that she expected the tree gone before the month was over. When he refused, her voice sharpened, her tone dripping with the certainty of someone who believed they held authority. That night, as the oak's branches swayed gently in the breeze, the man stood at his window, wondering what lengths she would go to. He didn't have to wait long to find out, because the very next day the city got involved. The letter arrived in a crisp white envelope with the official seal of the city printed in bold at the top. It wasn't the usual HOA stationery, and it certainly wasn't a friendly neighborly note. The heading read Notice of Violation, and beneath it, in stiff legal language, it outlined a complaint that had apparently been lodged regarding a potential obstruction to property view and sunlight access. The phrasing was vague, but the intent was clear. Someone had escalated the matter beyond neighborly dispute, dragging it into the realm of city bureaucracy. The man stood on his porch, reading the letter twice, then a third time. It cited a municipal code he had never heard of, something about maintaining property in a manner that does not negatively impact the value or utility of surrounding properties. The penalty for non-compliance could include fines and mandatory corrective action. There was even a deadline printed in red, giving him 30 days to resolve the issue or face further enforcement measures. He knew exactly who was behind it. The new neighbor had skipped over any reasonable conversation and gone straight to the authorities, turning a minor personal grievance into an official matter. Her persistence wasn't surprising anymore. What shocked him was how quickly the city responded. It was as if her complaint had been treated with urgency, perhaps because she had framed it as a matter of property rights. That afternoon, a white city vehicle pulled up to the curb. 2 code enforcement officers stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began walking around the front yard. They measured the distance from the trunk to the property line, inspected the height of the branches, and took photographs from multiple angles. One of them even crossed the street to take pictures from the neighbor's yard, capturing the view she claimed was obstructed. The man stood by, silent, as they completed their inspection. The officers weren't hostile, but they were firm. They explained that a formal investigation had been opened, and the city would determine whether the oak violated any municipal codes. It was made clear that if it did, removal might be required, and at his expense. Over the next week, the atmosphere on the street changed. Neighbors noticed the city visits and began whispering among themselves. Some were sympathetic, recalling how the tree had stood for decades without causing trouble. Others avoided the subject altogether, not wanting to get caught in the middle. The man noticed more than one set of curtains twitching when he went outside, as if people were watching the drama unfold like a slow-moving show. Then came the second letter. This time, it was a preliminary determination. According to the city's assessment, the oak tree was indeed in excess of reasonable height for its location, and may impede the enjoyment and use of adjacent properties. The recommendation: removal or significant trimming to reduce its height and spread. Failure to comply would result in daily fines until the matter was resolved. It was a crushing blow. The oak was healthy and beautiful, but now it was caught in a legal snare. Cutting it down would cost thousands, not to mention the loss of a piece of his home's history. But resisting would mean facing escalating penalties. The neighbor's satisfaction was almost palpable. She had begun spending more time in her front yard, often glancing toward the tree with a smug expression. On several occasions, he noticed her speaking with passing neighbors in hushed tones, no doubt spinning the story in her favor. But the man wasn't ready to surrender. If the city was going to force his hand, he wanted to understand the exact rules they were citing. That night, he pored over municipal codes, searching for any detail that could work in his favor. Hours of reading led him to a crucial realization. The clause being used against him was vague and rarely enforced. In fact, most of the cases where it had been applied involved hazardous trees, not healthy ones. There was also a little-known provision stating that any tree planted before a certain year was considered a heritage tree, making it exempt from removal unless it posed an imminent danger. The oak had been there for decades before he moved in. If he could prove its age and historical significance, the city might have no choice but to back off. Armed with this knowledge, he contacted a certified arborist to conduct a full evaluation. The expert measured the trunk, examined the growth rings, and confirmed what he had suspected. The tree was well over the threshold to qualify as a heritage specimen. It was perfectly healthy, structurally sound, and had deep cultural and ecological value for the neighborhood. When the man submitted the report to the city, the case took a sudden turn. The heritage tree status meant the city couldn't force its removal without substantial cause. Instead, the investigation was paused while the legal department reviewed the new information. The pause, however, didn't stop the neighbor. She doubled down, filing a second complaint, this time claiming the tree was damaging her property's foundation and creating a safety hazard. It was a new angle, one that would bring inspectors back yet again. The battle was far from over, and now it wasn't just about keeping the oak. It was about proving that her crusade was nothing more than a personal vendetta dressed up as concern for the neighborhood. The man had no idea yet, but the next phase of this fight would shift from private disputes to public spectacle, and it would not end the way she imagined. The city's second round of inspections began on an overcast morning. A light drizzle slicked the streets as the white municipal truck rolled up again, parking in front of the man's driveway. This time, the officers were joined by a building inspector, a stern-looking man carrying a laser measuring device and a camera bag. They didn't waste time on pleasantries, moving directly to the side of the property line that bordered the neighbor's yard. The claim they were investigating now was more serious: alleged structural damage to her home caused by the oak's roots. This was no longer about blocked views or too much shade. If the city concluded that the roots were pushing against her foundation, the outcome could be disastrous. Not only could it override the heritage tree protection, but it could also saddle the man with an astronomical bill for repairs. The neighbor watched from her porch as the inspectors worked, her arms folded across her chest, an umbrella tucked neatly under her elbow. There was a faint air of triumph about her, an unspoken certainty that this was the step that would finally force compliance. She didn't need to say anything. The expression alone was enough to convey her anticipation of victory. For nearly 2 hours, the inspectors examined the area. They used ground-penetrating radar to detect root patterns, measured the soil displacement near the property line, and checked the stability of her foundation. The process was meticulous, and every measurement seemed to be taken twice, as if they knew the stakes were high for both sides. By late afternoon, the truck drove away without giving an immediate verdict. But it wasn't long before the man received an official update in his email. The findings were clear. The roots of the oak tree extended partially toward the neighbor's property, but there was no evidence, none, that they had damaged her home. The foundation cracks she had pointed to were common hairline fractures found in many older houses, unrelated to root activity. For the first time since this dispute began, the man felt a small shift in momentum. The city's report essentially dismantled her latest claim, leaving her without solid ground to continue that particular line of attack. But if he thought that would end the matter, he underestimated her persistence. Within days, she tried a new approach, this time through the Homeowners Association. The HOA board received a formal complaint alleging that the tree was lowering the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood and therefore affecting property values. While the HOA had no authority to override city protection laws, they did have the power to impose fines for violations of their own covenants, some of which were notoriously vague. The man found himself summoned to an HOA meeting, a small but tense gathering held in the community center. Several board members sat at a folding table, papers stacked before them. The neighbor was present too, seated in the front row, her posture stiff and her face wearing that same polished look of superiority. She outlined her grievances in a rehearsed manner, using phrases like communal harmony and shared neighborhood vision. But what she hadn't anticipated was that the oak tree had more defenders than she realized. Other residents spoke up, not loudly, but with quiet conviction, about the beauty and value it brought to the community. One elderly couple mentioned how they'd taken family photos beneath it for years. A young mother described how her children loved playing in its shade during the summer. The tree, it seemed, was more than just a piece of landscaping. It was part of the neighborhood's shared history. The HOA board decided not to issue fines, stating that they could not penalize a homeowner for maintaining a healthy, city-protected heritage tree. This decision marked the second official blow to her campaign, and it clearly rattled her. For the first time, the man noticed cracks in her composure. Her lips pressed tighter, her eyes narrowing as she left the meeting quickly, without lingering for post-meeting chatter. But the conflict had already moved beyond private disagreements and into the public eye. Word of the dispute began to spread, first among neighbors, then on local social media groups. Someone posted a thread on the community's Facebook page detailing the drama in broad strokes, describing a certain new resident trying to take down a historic oak tree. Comments poured in, with most siding against the complainer. The neighbor's reputation began to shift. She was no longer just the meticulous new homeowner. She was the one trying to kill the oak. It was a label that stuck, and one that she could feel every time she walked down the street and caught the brief, assessing glances of others. Rather than de-escalate, she seemed to double down again. Perhaps fueled by pride, perhaps unwilling to back down in the face of mounting public opinion, she filed yet another formal complaint with the city, this time claiming the tree was a public safety hazard due to its large, overhanging branches. Her assertion was that they could fall and injure someone, and she argued for proactive removal to prevent a tragedy. The city was now obligated to send yet another inspector, this time a public safety officer specializing in urban forestry. The man welcomed the visit, confident that the arborist's earlier health assessment would hold up under scrutiny. The safety inspection confirmed it. The oak was strong, healthy, and not at risk of branch failure. The inspector noted that regular pruning, which the man had been diligent about, was more than enough to keep it safe. By now, the neighbors' complaints were starting to read like a pattern of harassment in the city's records. And patterns, when documented, could be turned against the instigator. The man began quietly keeping copies of every letter, report, and email, an organized paper trail that painted a very clear picture of events. What started as a nuisance had grown into a campaign of baseless accusations. And while she didn't yet realize it, the longer she kept pushing, the more she was building a case against herself. One that could result in consequences she hadn't imagined. The next step in this battle wouldn't be about inspections or HOA meetings. It was about to move into the legal arena, where the city itself would have the final word. By the time the third official inspection had cleared the oak tree of any danger, the situation had shifted in a way the neighbor hadn't anticipated. The city's files now contained a chronological list of her complaints, each one investigated and dismissed. For any other resident, this would have been a sign to let the matter rest. But for her, it only seemed to sharpen her resolve. She had invested too much pride into this battle to back down quietly. The man, however, was no longer reacting from a place of frustration. He had been gathering every document, every email, every piece of correspondence related to the case. Each one told the same story. A healthy, legally protected tree was being targeted by one individual with personal grievances. It wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was beginning to look like harassment. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from the city's legal department. It wasn't addressed only to him, but also to the neighbor next door. The letter was formal, the language measured yet firm. It stated that the city had reviewed the repeated complaints and determined that they were unfounded. Furthermore, it warned that continued submission of baseless claims could be considered misuse of municipal resources, potentially resulting in fines or legal action. This was the first official pushback from the authorities, and it marked a dramatic shift in tone. The city, which had once seemed poised to side with her, was now drawing a line in the sand. It wasn't an outright victory for the man yet, but it was a crack in the armor of her campaign. Still, she wasn't ready to let go. Days after receiving the warning, she attempted a different angle, this time contacting the local media. A small neighborhood news outlet published a short article about a view dispute between two homeowners. The piece was vague, careful not to name names, but the implication was that an oversized tree was a nuisance in an otherwise peaceful block. The man saw it for what it was, an attempt to sway public opinion back in her favor. But instead of convincing the neighborhood, it seemed to have the opposite effect. In the comments section beneath the online article, anonymous users, almost certainly locals, shared their own experiences of enjoying the oak tree's shade, its seasonal beauty, and its history. Some even hinted that they knew exactly who was behind the push to have it removed. It wasn't long before the story spread beyond the neighborhood page, making its way into larger local discussion groups. The narrative shifted again, this time portraying her as the disruptive force. The more she tried to control the conversation, the more it slipped away from her. The man stayed silent publicly, choosing instead to let the momentum build naturally. He knew that speaking out could make the dispute appear like a personal feud, but allowing others to share their views gave the issue a sense of community ownership. And the community, it turned out, was firmly on his side. Meanwhile, the oak tree stood unchanged, a constant presence through the storm of human conflict swirling around it. Its leaves rustled gently in the wind, oblivious to the arguments, letters, and accusations. To the man, it became a symbol of endurance. Then came the moment that tipped the scale completely. The city council, during a regular session, reviewed the issue of heritage trees after receiving multiple public inquiries. The man's case was used as an example of why the protections existed in the first place. It was discussed in detail, with council members reaffirming that heritage trees were not to be removed for subjective reasons, such as blocking a view or personal preference. This public reaffirmation was broadcast online, and clips began circulating in the community. People could now see for themselves that the city wasn't just tolerating the oak, it was defending it. The neighbor's position had been publicly undermined by the very authorities she had once believed would side with her. But the council meeting revealed something else, something even more significant. When the city investigated the matter fully, they discovered that the neighbor's complaints had consumed an unusual amount of municipal resources. The number of site visits, the hours spent on reports, and the administrative processing all added up to a cost, one that taxpayers had effectively been covering. That revelation didn't sit well with residents, many of whom voiced frustration that public funds had been wasted on a dispute that could have been resolved without city intervention. The backlash was swift. Within days, a petition circulated demanding that frivolous complaints be subject to cost recovery fees. The petition gained signatures quickly, with more than half the neighborhood signing within a week. The man didn't start the petition. He didn't need to. The community was doing it on its own, driven not just by affection for the oak, but by frustration with the constant disruption caused by one resident's obsession. For the neighbor, the isolation was becoming clear. Her allies, if she had any to begin with, were silent. Her once friendly waves were now met with indifference, her presence on the street ignored by those who had grown tired of the drama. And as the city moved to finalize its position, she found herself in the exact position she had tried to force on someone else, powerless to change the outcome. But the matter wasn't entirely closed. The city still had to issue its final decision in writing, and there was a lingering question of whether she would face any formal penalties for the repeated, unfounded complaints. That decision, and the way it was delivered, would turn this private feud into a very public lesson in consequences. The letter that arrived in early spring carried the weight of months of tension. It bore the city's seal in bold black ink, and its language was crisp, deliberate, and final. Inside, the pages outlined the results of the city's complete investigation, the culmination of every inspection, meeting, and complaint. The oak tree, it declared unequivocally, was a protected heritage tree in perfect health, posing no hazard to property or public safety. Its preservation was mandatory, and any attempt to alter or remove it without authorization would result in severe penalties. But the decision didn't stop there. The document included a section that addressed the neighbor's role in the drawn-out conflict. It listed each of her formal complaints, dates, times, and the outcomes of inspections. The list stretched on for nearly a page, a precise record of her persistence. And then, in the most telling part of the letter, it stated that these repeated unfounded claims had resulted in excessive and unnecessary use of municipal resources. The city had chosen to impose an administrative fine, citing misuse of official channels. The amount wasn't trivial. It was large enough to sting, the kind of fine that demanded immediate payment or risk of further legal action. It was, in many ways, a symbolic verdict as much as a financial one, a public acknowledgement that her campaign had crossed from persistence into wasteful harassment. The man read it slowly, not out of disbelief, but to savor the rare moment of official vindication. Months of enduring inspections, HOA meetings, whispered gossip, and thinly veiled hostility had led to this, a written, binding document that not only protected the oak but penalized the very person who had tried to destroy it. The news traveled quickly through the neighborhood. The city's decision, while not meant for public release, became common knowledge within days. It started with the HOA board members, who had been copied on the notice, and spread through casual conversations, text messages, and the ever-active community Facebook page. People discussed the outcome in driveways, on morning walks, and at the small coffee shop 2 streets over. The tone was almost unanimous. The oak was safe, and the troublemaker had finally been put in her place. The neighbor, once so visible and vocal, all but disappeared from public view. Her routines changed. No more lingering in the yard with folded arms. No more casual checking of property lines. Even the bright patio furniture that had once stood like a symbol of her presence now sat unused, fading slightly under the sun. But while she withdrew, the man's connection to the community quietly deepened. Neighbors who had once been polite but distant now waved more warmly, some stopping to chat briefly when he was outside. People mentioned how happy they were to see the tree remain, how it made the street feel alive. He never gloated, never spoke ill of her, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. She had tried to bend the neighborhood to her will, and the neighborhood had bent back. The city's ruling also meant that any future attempt to remove the oak would face an even steeper uphill battle. The heritage designation was now reinforced by multiple official reports, and any complaint lodged against it would be reviewed in light of her history. In other words, she had effectively made it nearly impossible for herself or anyone to challenge the tree again. But the man understood that the story wasn't entirely over. The city's decision had given him the upper hand, but the fine, the humiliation, and the public perception had left her wounded pride simmering. And people with wounded pride often looked for ways to regain control, even if it meant digging themselves into a deeper hole. In the weeks that followed, small signs suggested that she hadn't given up entirely. He noticed her speaking in hushed tones to another homeowner down the street, her hands moving in subtle but animated gestures. Once, he saw her walk past the oak and glance up at its branches with a look that was neither admiration nor resignation. It was calculation. Then came the unexpected invitation. The HOA announced that, as part of their spring community cleanup event, they would be holding a public meeting to discuss neighborhood improvements. The agenda mentioned landscaping guidelines, property maintenance standards, and view protection considerations. The phrase was vague, but it was enough to make the man wary. He suspected that she might see this as her final opportunity to reframe the narrative, to rally some support under the guise of broader community interest. The difference now was that the city's ruling was on his side, and the majority of the neighborhood had already chosen theirs. The stage was set for one more confrontation, not a private one in letters or inspections, but a public moment where everyone could witness the outcome. And in that moment, the balance of power would either shift permanently in his favor or give her the chance to claw back a measure of control. What neither of them knew yet was that this meeting would not only settle the matter once and for all, but it would also bring an ending so humiliating for her that it would leave no room for future disputes. The morning of the city council hearing arrived with an air of anticipation that hung thick over the neighborhood. It was as if every pair of eyes on the street knew what was about to unfold. The weather was crisp, the sun filtering gently through the branches of the oak tree, still standing tall and unwavering, its leaves whispering quietly in the breeze. By the time the hearing commenced, the small chamber was filled with an unusual mixture of officials, neighbors, and curious onlookers. The council members sat in their raised seats, papers neatly arranged in front of them, expressions carefully neutral but with a hint of interest. This was, after all, more than just a dispute over a tree. It had evolved into a matter of public attention, an example of how quickly petty grievances could spiral out of control. The city inspector presented first. With a clear, steady voice, he laid out the facts. The oak tree was older than most of the homes in the neighborhood, its roots stable, its branches healthy. No evidence of disease, no encroachment on property lines beyond what was legally permissible. Most importantly, it was classified as a protected heritage tree, meaning its removal without proper clearance would be a direct violation of city ordinances. Maps were shown, photographs displayed, and the legal statutes cited. The more the inspector spoke, the heavier the weight seemed to settle on Karen, who sat rigid in her chair, eyes fixed forward but face noticeably tense. The council members listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, their expressions giving little away. When Karen's turn came, she rose with visible reluctance. Her arguments, once delivered with self-assured bravado, now felt thinner, complaints about a blocked view, and alleged safety concerns that the inspector's report had already dismantled. The murmurs in the audience grew slightly louder with each flimsy point she raised. Her words, meant to sound authoritative, began to falter under the collective scrutiny of the room. The The council deliberated briefly but efficiently. When they returned, the verdict was swift. The oak tree would remain untouched, and any further attempts to have it removed without city approval would result in heavy fines. But that was not all. In a rare move, the council imposed a penalty for the false safety claim Karen had lodged, citing misuse of city resources and deliberate filing of misleading reports. She would be required to cover the inspection costs and issue a formal public apology to the homeowner. The room was silent for a heartbeat before a wave of quiet whispers swept through it. Karen's face flushed, her lips tightening as the weight of the decision settled on her shoulders. There was no room for argument. This was final. In the days that followed, the apology was printed in the local community newsletter, each word a stark reminder of how quickly an overreach could backfire. Neighbors who had once been indifferent to the tension now viewed her with wary glances. The air of control she had tried to maintain was gone, replaced with a fragile caution that hadn't been there before. Meanwhile, the oak tree stood unchanged, its roots anchored deep, its branches stretching outward as though claiming victory in its own silent way. The homeowner often found himself standing at its base, feeling the rough bark beneath his fingertips, appreciating its steadfast presence more than ever. It had been more than just a tree. It had been a line in the sand, a symbol that not every unreasonable demand would go unchallenged. And so, the neighborhood returned to its quiet routines. Lawns were mowed, cars washed, holiday decorations put up in their time. But the memory of the dispute lingered like a faint echo, a cautionary tale passed along in hushed conversations. Everyone knew now that some battles were not only unwinnable but also unforgettable. For Karen, it was a hard-earned lesson in limits and consequences. For the homeowner, it was a reminder that standing firm, no matter how relentless the pressure, could yield not just a personal victory, but a lasting example for everyone watching. And for the oak tree, it was simply another season. Its roots deep, its branches strong, its presence eternal against the slow march of time. 2.